The term Dark Ages is probably a term you've heard used to describe the Middle Ages. Maybe it was first in your middle school or high school history class, and it makes us think of images of ignorance, superstition, and just intellectual stagnation. However, this characterization is not only misleading, it's incorrect. And in this video, we're going to find out that the Middle Ages were in fact a time of remarkable intellectual, scientific, philosophical, and also cultural development, with the Christian church playing a pivotal role in preserving, advancing, and sharing knowledge that ultimately laid the groundwork for the Renaissance and the scientific revolution. But before we do that, let's break some common myths about the so-called Dark Ages. The first myth is that people believed the earth was flat. I guess that's where Reddit came from. In reality, educated medieval scholars were very well aware that the earth was spherical. The ancient Greeks' knowledge of a round earth had been preserved and was well understood by medieval scholars. Second myth is that medieval people were extremely superstitious and ignored science. And contrary to this belief, the medieval period was actually a time of significant scientific inquiry. Scholars developed complex philosophical and scientific methodologies, and they made advancements in mathematics, astronomy, medicine, and natural philosophy. And the third myth is that the church suppressed all scientific thought. It's probably the most widespread misconception. In reality, the church was a primary supporter of learning, scientific inquiry. Monasteries preserved ancient texts, established schools, universities, and ultimately supported scholarly research. Marriage.
Marriage is what brings us together today.
Myth 4 is that everyone was dirty and lived in extreme poverty. Now, yes, living conditions were certainly different from today, but medieval people were not uniformly impoverished or unhygienic. Many systems had sophisticated water management systems, public baths existed, and there were well-developed concepts of personal hygiene. Just teenage boys didn't have Axe yet. Myth 5, women had no rights or importance, and medieval society was more complex than this simplistic view. Many women held significant roles, particularly in religious institutions. Hildegard of Bingen was a powerful intellect and political figure who wrote extensively on science, medicine, and theology. There were women who managed estates, ran businesses, had legal rights that were much more substantial than many people realize. Myth 6 is that everyone was illiterate. Now, literacy was not as widespread as today, but it wasn't non-existent. Monasteries were centers of learning. Many people could read to some degree, and universities were flourishing. And there was also this growing class of educated individuals across various social strata. So it wasn't just the rich. Now, these myths persist largely due to a combination of historical misunderstandings, simplified narratives, and it's this tendency to view the past through what C.S. Lewis called chronological snobbery. It's when we uncritically accept the intellectual climate common to our own age, and we assume that whatever has gone out of date is discredited. And this is why you think the music of when you were in high school or college is the best. Creed, anyone? In reality, the Dark Ages were a period of significant intellectual, cultural, and technological development that laid the groundwork for the Renaissance and the scientific revolution. And hey, if you're enjoying this by far and you want to see more content like it, let me know by hitting the like button. It really helps. And so during a time that is often characterized in the 20th and 21st century as intellectually barren, Christian monasteries, they emerged as the primary seat of knowledge preservation, but also of intellectual pursuit. And so monastic scriptores, they were full of learning, where monks meticulously copied and preserved classical texts from Greece and Rome that otherwise probably would have been lost to history. And the caricature is that they were only feverishly copying the Bible. I feel bad for the guy who got stuck with Leviticus, but that wasn't the case. They actually preserved all types of literature. The Benedictine order in particular played a significant role in intellectual preservation. Founded by Saint Benedict of Nursia in the 6th century, the order's motto was Ora et Labora, pray and work. That is not a spell from Hermione.
Wingardium Leviosa.
And it emphasized the importance of both spiritual contemplation, and intellectual labor. And so monasteries were much more than religious institutions. They were comprehensive centers of education, research, and cultural development. But here's something else you might not know. Monks didn't merely copy existing texts. They actively engaged with them. They created commentaries. They developed new interpretations, and they maintained this living intellectual traditions. There were monasteries in Italy, in France, and in Switzerland that became renowned centers of scholarship. That they housed extensive libraries and produced some of the most significant intellectual work of the medieval period. And the medieval monks were instrumental in preserving, but also transmitting knowledge across linguistic and cultural boundaries. They translated works from Greek and Arabic into Latin. And what were they doing? They were ensuring that scientific and philosophical texts remained accessible. And this translation movement was particularly crucial in preserving and reintroducing works by ancient philosophers like Aristotle and scientific treatises that might have been lost during periods of political instability. In the Middle Ages, they also witnessed significant technological and agricultural advancements. The heavy plow, horse collar, the three-field crop rotating system, and windmills revolutionized agricultural productivity. And so these innovations dramatically increased food production, which supported population growth and created economic surplus. So, because basic needs were covered, this enabled further intellectual and cultural development. And then medieval scholars made substantial contributions to mathematics and astronomy. The introduction of the Arabic numerals and the concept of zero, it transformed computational capacity. Thinkers like Pope Sylvester II were instrumental in spreading mathematical knowledge through Europe. And during this period, Islamic scholars often worked in harmony with Christians, making groundbreaking advances in algebra, trigonometry, and astronomical observation. And it was the Islamic philosophers like Ibn Sina who exposed Greek philosophy to Western thinkers like Thomas Aquinas. And then there were the medical advancements. And medieval medicine was far more sophisticated than previously believed. Monastic institutions, they established some of the first hospitals and medical schools. The school of Salerno in Italy, found around the 9th century, was one of the first and most prominent medical institutions in medieval Europe. And so physicians like Hildegard of Bingen, she was a 12th century Benedictine abbess, wrote extensively on medicine, botany, natural healing. Her work, Physica, it demonstrated a remarkable understanding of herbal medicine and holistic health approaches that were centuries ahead of her time. So she was into essential oils before it was a multi-level marketing scheme. Then philosophical and educational developments. Scholasticism, which is a method of critical thought, it dominated medieval academic life. And it represented a sophisticated approach to understanding the relationship between faith and reason. And so scholars like Thomas Aquinas, they developed complex philosophical frameworks that sought to reconcile these classical philosophical traditions like Aristotle with Christian theology. And Aquinas' work, particularly his Summa Theologica, it demonstrated this extraordinary intellectual rigor that challenged simplistic notions of medieval thought. And so by systematically examining philosophical arguments, engaging with potential counterarguments, and then developing more nuanced theological interpretations, scholastic thinkers established this methodological foundation that would influence future scientific and philosophical inquiry for centuries. And perhaps one of the most significant pieces in the medieval period was the emergence of the university as an institutional model of higher education. Universities in Paris, Cambridge, Oxford, they became centers of advanced learning, and they attracted scholars from across Europe. And these institutions, they developed structured curricula, established academic degrees, and created frameworks for scholar debate and knowledge transmissions. So you can blame the monks for having to take humanities. And contrary to popular misconceptions, medieval universities were not these just restrictive religious institutions. They were dynamic intellectual environments. They fostered critical thinking. They encouraged debate, and they provided structured paths for intellectual exploration across a variety of disciplines, including, yes, theology, but law, medicine, and the liberal arts. And then Gothic architecture. This emerged in the 12th century, and it represented a remarkable technological but also artistic achievement that cathedrals like Notre Dame in Paris demonstrated extraordinary engineering, sophistication, and really they were pushing the boundaries of architectural design and construction techniques. And so these structures, they weren't just religious monuments, but they were complex expressions of theological, mathematical, and artistic understanding. And the intricate design of Gothic cathedrals incorporated advanced structural engineering. I mean, just think about this. How many of those cathedrals still stand today while so many other buildings have come and gone? Rest in peace, Blockbuster.
Hello, welcome to Blockbuster.
And the Christian church of the Middle Ages was not an impediment to intellectual progress. There was no church sign that said a free thinker is Satan's slave. Rather, churches were a primary catalyst for scientific and philosophical advancement. Monastic orders, they established schools, they preserved ancient texts, and they created environments that spurred on and encouraged learning. And so church institutions provided some of the few stable environments for sustained intellectual work during periods of political instability. So monasteries offered resources, protection, and institutional support for scholars. And so they established this long-term research and knowledge preservation. And what we find is that it was ecclesiastical institutions that supported scholars, providing funding for research, creating networks for knowledge exchange. The church sponsored translations, maintained libraries, and created institutional frameworks that enabled intellectual collaboration across different regions and also cultural contexts. And so the characterization of the Middle Ages as a period of darkness and intellectual stagnation, it is a fundamentally flawed narrative. And this misrepresentation often stems from a limited understanding of the period's complexity. So how did we get here? The term Dark Ages has a fascinating origin, and it reveals more about the bias of later historians than the actual period itself. The phrase was first coined by an Italian scholar named Francisco Petrarch in the 1330s, around there. And he was a Renaissance humanist, and he used the term to describe the perceived cultural and intellectual decline following the fall of the Western Roman Empire. Because from his perspective, the period between the fall of Rome, around 476 CE, and the Renaissance represented a time of intellectual darkness compared to the perceived brilliance of classical antiquity. Now, there's a few reasons of why he landed there. First is historical context, because the collapse of the Western Roman Empire, it created significant political fragmentation. It reduced centralized governance, which led to perceived cultural instability. But in truth, it led to cultural expansion because there wasn't this forced cultural assimilation from the Hellenistic world. There was a loss of sophisticated Roman infrastructure and administrative systems, leading to decreased urban populations, which just created economic complexity, but again, expansion. And then there was the intellectual perspective of Renaissance scholars. So Renaissance humanists like Petrarch, they viewed classical Greek and Roman civilization as the pinnacle of human achievement. And they saw the medieval period as a time of intellectual regression characterized by reduced classical learning, predominance of religious thinking, and in their minds, less sophisticated artistic and architectural styles. And then cultural bias. Later, Enlightenment philosophers like Voltaire and Edward Gibbon, they further popularized the term, and here's what they were doing. They were emphasizing the religious domination of intellectual life. Now, what they perceived as a lack of scientific progress and a limit of artistic and cultural development. And so they mapped it as being intellectual suppression by the church. However, modern historians strongly reject this characterization. Contemporary scholarship, they demonstrate that the medieval period was a time of significant technological innovation, It was a period of complex philosophical and scientific development, and it was an era of remarkable cultural and artistic achievements. The term Dark Ages now, it's considered outdated and intellectually misleading. In fact, if you're younger and watching this, there's a good chance you didn't hear about the term in your middle school or high school history class. And so today, better terms for this period are early Middle Ages, medieval period, late antiquity. And ironically, the very scholars who coined the term Dark Ages were engaging in precisely the kind of narrow-minded thinking they accused medieval scholars of practicing. And modern research reveals the medieval period was complex, innovative, and a time of significant human achievement and intellectual growth. And the persistence of the Dark Ages myth, it demonstrates how historical narratives can be shaped by cultural biases, limited understanding, and it highlights the importance of continuous historical re-examination. That the medieval period should be understood as a dynamic era of transformation and intellectual adaptation rather than a period of regression. Now, it was a period of synthesis where classical knowledge was preserved, reinterpreted, and integrated with an emerging Christian philosophical traditions.